Hello and welcome back to the APUS History Curriculum. We are now moving into the fourth time period covered in APUSH, which covers the years 1800 through 1848. It begins with the election of 1800 and ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ends the Mexican War. But this is where things get a little messy. Where the earlier time periods had a nice, neat ending point, and that was then the beginning point of the next era, this one does not. In fact, although this period ends with the Mexican War, we won't even talk about it until the next time period since there's an overlap. This time period also has two very different presidential personalities that dominate different parts of the time period. Thomas Jefferson for the first half and Andrew Jackson for the second half. So I'm splitting this era into two separate units for the purposes of our class at BMHS. There are still overlapping key concepts, though, so make sure you pay attention to the themes that carry over between the two. The key concepts for this time period focus on the U.S. attempts to build a modern democracy and put into practice the forms of government that they had created in the aftermath of the Revolution, and to adapt their society to those ideals. The key concepts also focus on the innovations that changed the American economy, which in turn spurred America's interest in foreign trade and led to dramatic changes in U.S. society, as well as the creation of both national and regional identities. Some of the key topics covered in Unit 4 include the rise of political parties in the era of Jefferson, politics and regional interests, America on the world stage, and the market revolution. Then in Unit 5, we will look at expanding democracy, Jackson and federal power, the development of an American culture, the Second Great Awakening, the reform movements of the early 19th century, and the role of African Americans in the early republic. Now, this unit overall covers the time period again, 1800 to 1848, and in this particular video, 4.2, we're going to look at the rise of political parties in the era of Thomas Jefferson in the early part of this time period. We will be specifically looking at the debates about the role of government in society, politics, and the economy. We will define what those debates were, what caused them, and most importantly, what the effects of those debates were. Now, this is a big one, so let's get to it. Because of increased resentment towards the Federalist Party due to their passage of the Alien and Sedition laws, which were seen by opponents as clear governmental overreach and concentrating decisions, like what non-citizens were considered dangerous enough to deport, into the hands of just one individual. Remember, opponents in Virginia and Kentucky had responded by passing laws nullifying those federal laws within their state borders, and these resolutions had been written by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and of course at the time, Jefferson was the sitting vice president. Since this was happening on the eve of the election of 1800, it is clear that this was going to be a battle of political parties. The parties differed dramatically and were nearly opposites of one another. The Federalists were strongest in the Northeast, whereas the Republicans were the strongest in the South. The Republicans strongly supported the principles of states' rights, opposed to strong centralized government, which of course is what the Federalists supported. The Federalists had support from wealthy people and from the upper class, and the Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, were supported largely by commoners and the middle class. The Federalists had a loose interpretation of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton having stated once that whatever was not forbidden in the Constitution could be done. Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, stipulated that the Constitution was to be strictly interpreted, meaning that the government could only do things that are stated in the Constitution and nothing else. Unless the Constitution gives the power of the Congress to do something, they couldn't be executed at all. The Federalists tended to be a pro-British party. Alexander Hamilton was certainly an advocate of trade, and he saw the British Empire as a powerful country with which good trading relationships could benefit the United States economy. The Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, were more of a pro-French party. They appreciated French politics and were allies with them during the French Revolution period, or at least they hoped to be. Remember, Washington declared neutrality. The Jeffersonians also distrusted the British monarchy in all respects, trade included. The Federalists thought that the economy of the United States should be based on merchants and trade. Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, believed that the economy of the United States should be based on agriculture, with farming being the backbone. The Federalists were supporters of the First Bank of the United States. They thought it would stimulate the economy and help build credit. Democratic Republicans didn't like the first version of the Bank of the United States, thinking that it favored the wealthy, and they were also against it because the Constitution never stated anything explicitly about it. Running in this election were John Adams and Charles Pinckney for the Federalists and Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr for the Democratic Republicans. There was technically no distinction between a vote for president and a vote for vice president, so all votes were counted together. Each elector casting 2 votes, and the candidate with a majority of the votes was elected president, and the vice presidency went to the runner-up. The Federalists, therefore, arranged for one of their electors to vote for John Jay rather than Pinckney so that there wouldn't be a tie. The Democratic Republicans had a similar plan to have one of their electors cast a vote for another candidate as opposed to Aaron Burr, but they failed to execute it. In the election itself, John Adams ended up finishing third, and Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr ended up tied with the same number of electoral votes. Therefore, the election would be thrown into the House of Representatives, since they decided the outcome of an election in the event that there was either a tie, as in this case, or no electoral majority. Since it was a tie, they could only choose amongst the tied candidates. But the House of Representatives was still controlled by the Federalist Party, even though they'd actually lost control of the House in the election of 1800 as well. It would be the outgoing Congress that would certify the election, count the electoral votes, and break the tie, not the incoming one. The vote amongst the House was even tied, even over numerous, 35 in all, attempts. It wasn't until Alexander Hamilton began encouraging fellow Federalists to choose Thomas Jefferson over Aaron Burr that the tie was ultimately broken. Hamilton believed, as he put it, that a man with the wrong principles was better than a man with no principles. Burr naturally was angry and never forgave Hamilton, although this incident is not the cause of their famous duel that would happen 4 years later. The significance of this election was that it was, in effect, a revolution. Power changed hands from one party to another, from one leader to another, in a contested election. And the losing party, the losing leader, willingly relinquished power as the Constitution required. This thus proved that this constitutional system of government and the handing of power from one person to another could, in fact, work. Jefferson had a vision for the nation, as did many Democratic Republicans, where the nation itself would spread out over the continent, with the people enjoying the bountiful produce of the land and sending its products, both those grown and those manufactured, across the seas in trade with other nations. For the most part, Jefferson envisioned America as being a nation of farmers with just a small and thriving merchant class. Early in his presidency, he discovered that Spain had negotiated a transfer of the Louisiana Territory to Napoleon Bonaparte and the French. The potential implications of this transfer was fear that the right of deposit, which had been granted by the Pinckney Treaty, could be revoked for the city of New Orleans, which could seriously hamper American trade for farmers in settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains. So Jefferson sent James Monroe to Paris to join the U.S. Minister to France, Robert Livingston, to negotiate to purchase the city of New Orleans and all or part of Florida to ensure that the lower Mississippi River would always be open to American trade. Monroe was authorized to spend up to $10 million. But upon arrival, Monroe learned that Napoleon's hopes for reestablishing a new France empire in North America was failing. He was dealing with a rebellion by slaves in Haiti, and his army there had been decimated by yellow fever. Plus, there was the increasing likelihood that there would be war between France and Britain, and then it was likely that the British coming down from Canada would just move in and take control of the Mississippi River Valley, and France would lose it anyway. They simply couldn't afford to send forces to occupy the entire Mississippi Valley, so why not abandon the idea of an empire in America and sell the territory to the United States? Monroe and Livingston immediately entered into negotiations and reached an agreement that actually exceeded their authority, as they purchased the entire Louisiana Territory, including New Orleans, for $15 million. The acquisition of approximately 827,000 square miles would double the size of the United States, and it works out to a cost of approximately 3 cents an acre. I mean, really, this is just too good of a deal to pass up. But there is a bit of a constitutional dilemma associated with this purchase, because nowhere in the Constitution was the purchase of territory mentioned. And remember, Jefferson had long been what was called a strict constructionist, believing in a strict interpretation of the Constitution and only doing what it said and nothing more. But he supported the purchase of the territory because it would promote the peace and security of the nation in general, and that was specifically mentioned in the Constitution, so essentially he's bending his principles for the good of the nation. Interestingly, it was the Federalists who offered some opposition to the treaty, though it does actually pass the Senate with overwhelming support. Well, now that we have the land, we need to find out what was there. So Jefferson appointed Army officers Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark to lead an expedition known as the Corps of Discovery to travel into the wilderness. It was hoped that the men could follow the Missouri River northward and then go all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Along the way, they were to investigate the plants and animals that lived in the region and negotiate peaceful relationships with Native Americans that lived there. The Corps of Discovery set out from St. Louis, Missouri in 1804, traveled along the Missouri River until reaching the Rocky Mountains, where they traded with the Shoshone tribe for horses that could get them through that rugged mountainous terrain. One of the translators that they hired happened to have a young wife who would prove to be particularly useful in these negotiations, because she was Shoshone, and she was not just a member of the tribe. As it turned out, she was the long-before-kidnapped sister of the then-current chief of the tribe that the expedition was trying to get horses from. The joyous reunion, of course, greatly benefited Lewis and Clark, and the Shoshone were actually known for being particularly distrusting of strangers. After leaving the Shoshone, they continued on through the Rocky Mountains, eventually arriving along the Pacific coast in what is present-day Oregon, along the Columbia River. They spent a winter there and then began their journey back towards St. Louis. In addition to mapping the northern part of the Louisiana Territory, the expedition also had scientific and political purposes. They documented natural resources and plants that had been previously unknown to Euro-Americans, describing more than 200 new plant and animal species. They also made contact with over 70 Native American tribes, attempting to establish friendly relationships, even inviting tribal chiefs to visit Jefferson in Washington. Members of the Corps of Discovery were the first Americans to cross the Continental Divide, the first to see Yellowstone. After the expedition was over, the maps that were produced would allow further discovery and settlement of this vast territory in the years and decades that followed. And you're going to see a similar expedition covering the southern part of the territory being explored by a man named Zebulon Pike, beginning in 1806. And again, he's got similar goals and similar accomplishments. Another area where you saw disputes over federal power was in the Supreme Court. First, a little background. In the election of 1800, you had the presidency switching parties from Federalists to Democratic Republicans. The House of Representatives and the Senate will also switch control to the Democratic-Republican Party. But the judicial branch would remain in the control of the Federalist Party because judges are appointed for life, and both Washington and Adams basically had been Federalists. To preserve some power in the final days of Adams' presidency, the Senate created a bunch of new judge positions, and Adams was furiously trying to fill these last-minute judicial appointments, these so-called midnight judges. One of the individuals he appointed at the last minute was actually the new Chief Justice, John Marshall, who would serve in that position all the way through 1835 and would be one of the most influential Chief Justices in American history, even deciding a case that set tremendous precedent and dealt with the very issue of last-minute judicial appointments. The case was Marbury v. Madison in 1803. William Marbury was also one of these last-minute judicial appointments, but since there were so many, not all of the letters of commission were delivered before Adams was officially out of office. When Jefferson was sworn in and appointed James Madison to be his Secretary of State, some of those letters of commission were still sitting on Madison's desk. At Jefferson's orders, Madison refused to deliver them. Since William Marbury was waiting for one, he sued Madison and tried to get the Supreme Court to issue what was called a writ of mandamus, which was a court order that would compel Madison to deliver the letter, an action that had been assigned as a power of the Supreme Court according to the Judiciary Act of 1789. In Marshall's 1803 ruling, he said that although Marbury was entitled to his appointment, according to the Judiciary Act, that law granting the Supreme Court the power to issue a writ forcing the delivery of a commission was actually not constitutional. Therefore, Marbury couldn't become a judge. Okay, what I want you to do right now is I actually want you to pause this video and go watch the one that I have linked here in the slides, and I'll put the link directly in the description box below because it gives you a really good overview of this court case. It is such a big one, you need to know about it. So go on, pause, and then come back. All right, so you're back. Continuing on. The Federalist Judge John Marshall had, of course, in the process of deciding Marbury v. Madison, he'd sacrificed a small Federalist victory, which was just one judge, for a much larger one, which is the reviewing of any law that might be passed by the now Democratic-Republican-controlled government. Really, the concept of judicial review wasn't new, and previous cases had technically looked at laws in the past, but they'd always upheld them. This one is significant primarily because it is the first time that the Supreme Court exercised its right of judicial review and overturned a law that was passed by Congress. A few other cases from the Marshall Court you should be aware of because they also relate to increased power of the federal government include McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819, which was an argument over whether or not a state had the power over an entity of the federal government, specifically if a state could tax a federal bank that was located within their state boundaries. Marshall's ruling stated that the power to tax was the power to destroy, and states could not destroy an entity of the federal government because national law trumped state law when the two were in conflict. Therefore, you have another expansion of federal power. Another case was Dartmouth College v. Woodward in 1819. The New Hampshire legislature attempted to change Dartmouth College, a privately funded institution, into a state university. The legislature changed the school's corporate charter by transferring the control of trustee appointments to the governor. In an attempt to regain authority over the resources of Dartmouth College, the old trustees filed suit against William Woodward, who sided with the new appointees. The Contract Clause, Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1, prohibits states from violating contracts with private or public corporations. The court concluded that the Contract Clause applies to private as well as public corporations. And the court held that the college's corporate charter qualified as a contract between private parties, with which the legislature could not interfere. Therefore, once again, federal law was supreme, and in this case it set the precedent for the rise of the American Business Corporation and the free enterprise system. And finally, you have the case of Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824. The state of New York passed a law giving Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston a monopoly on steamboat traffic on the Hudson Bay, and they in turn issued license to operate, and Aaron Ogden had one to navigate between New York City and the New Jersey shore. Ogden found himself in competition with a man named Thomas Gibbons, who had been given permission to use the waterways by the federal government. After the state of New York denied Gibbons access to the Hudson Bay, he sued Ogden. Marshall ruled that only Congress had the power to regulate interstate commerce because this involved traveling between New York and New Jersey, and therefore federal law was taking precedence over state law. All right, now let's talk about policy battles when it comes to relationships with European powers. Jefferson was, in general, a believer in a limited government, and as such, he didn't believe in maintaining a large military during peacetime, and had actually reduced the army to just 2,500 men, and the Navy just had a handful of ships. However, raids on merchant ships by pirates along the North African coast, called the Barbary Coast, was testing the need for naval defenses. Now, it was customary for nations at the time to pay to ransom back ships and crews that had been captured, and sometimes to even pay to prevent capture in the first place. Previous presidents had paid the rulers along the Barbary Coast to not, or at least minimally, attack American merchant ships. But remember the rallying cry around the whole XYZ affair from John Adams' administration, millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. Well, Jefferson remembered that too, and so he stopped those payments altogether, especially once an increase was demanded by the Pasha of Tripoli. As a result, the Barbary pirates began attacking American ships in earnest. Reluctantly, Jefferson ordered the U.S. Navy to provide some protection along the shores of Tripoli to these American merchant ships. The conflict continued for several years before finally being resolved by treaty. It was never a particularly large or even really a formal war, but it did give the United States Navy some much-needed experience, and that experience would be very beneficial to the nation when the War of 1812 broke out. And speaking of that war, there's yet another policy battle relating to it that we need to discuss here. First, let's remember that the issue of impressment had been going on since the administration of George Washington. He had even sent John Jay to Britain to try and negotiate an end to the practice, but Jay's treaty hadn't really solved the issue. As the war between Britain and France continued, impressment of American sailors continued because Britain was desperately in need of men for their navy. So essentially, Britain wasn't respecting our independence. In addition, Americans were continuing their expansion into areas west of the Appalachian Mountains, and of course were constantly in conflict with the Native Americans who were already living there. And so when it was discovered that the British were sending aid to a confederacy of Native Americans who were attacking westward migrating settlers, the people began clamoring for war against Britain. Now, to be clear, the aid that the British were sending was minimal, but that really didn't matter all that much to most Americans. Democratic Republicans in the House were demanding war, and so the country, now led by James Madison, did exactly that. The Federalists fiercely opposed participating in this war, largely because they feared how the war might disrupt their trade with Britain, and they even called a meeting, the Hartford Convention, late in 1814, and this is well into the war itself, threatening to secede from the Union over the disagreement. But as it turns out, by the time their meeting was done, the war was actually over and the Americans had won. All right, not really. But they hadn't lost it. And because the final battle actually occurs after the war, and we do actually win that final battle, you're at least going to see a surge of American nationalism because our perception is that we won. And we're going to see this costing the Federalists tremendous popular support, so much so that they will actually cease to exist. But we'll talk a bit more about that war and its aftermath in a future topic video. All right, so that's what you need to know about topic 4.2, the rise of political parties and the age of Thomas Jefferson.